The Interstellar Combat Academy of Vex Prime occupied a space station the size of a small moon, which was fitting because its operational budget could have purchased several small moons. Here, the galaxy's most promising warriors came to learn the ancient art of beating the living daylights out of each other in increasingly creative ways. The facility boasted 300 training halls, each equipped with gravity modulators, atmospheric processors, and medical bays sophisticated enough to reattach limbs that really should have stayed attached. The Academy's motto, carved in 17 languages across its main entrance, read, "Excellence through controlled violence." The cafeteria food, however, remained universally terrible across all species, proving that some things were truly beyond the reach of advanced technology. The student body represented 47 different species from across 6 spiral arms, each bringing their own unique talents to the art of combat. The Vornaki could phase through solid matter for exactly 3 seconds, which made them exceptional at surprise attacks and terrible at holding their liquor. The Thessian Razorbacks possessed 4 arms and reaction times that made hummingbirds look sluggish. The crystalline Shardborn could alter their body density at will, becoming either diamond hard or flowing like water. And then there were the humans, who had been admitted to the Academy 5 years ago after prolonged debate and several unfortunate incidents that the Galactic Council preferred not to discuss in polite company. Humans occupied a peculiar space in galactic combat doctrine. They were not the strongest species. That honor belonged to the Chromagen, who could bench press starfighters. They were not the fastest. The Zephyri moved so quickly, they existed in a permanent state of motion blur. They lacked the Mindweaver's telepathy, the Skorathi's venomous biology, or the Draven's ability to breathe fire without requiring a lighter. What humans did possess, however, was a certain unreasonable quality that made other species profoundly uncomfortable. They approached combat with the enthusiasm of someone who had received a surprise birthday party. Except the surprise was violence, and they were very pleased about it. The Combat Fundamentals classroom on Deck 17 could accommodate 60 students and featured walls reinforced with quantum-locked titanium alloy, which said something about the Academy's insurance premiums. Instructor Vex Rahl, a 12-foot-tall Chromagan with more scars than original skin, stood at the front of the combat mat with his forearms crossed in what other species recognized as his "someone is about to learn a painful lesson" pose. His species had evolved from apex predators on a death world, where the plants were carnivorous and the herbivores were just confused carnivores. He had been teaching combat technique for 17 years and had seen every variety of arrogance, stupidity, and overconfidence the galaxy could produce. "Today," Vex Rahl announced in a voice like grinding continental plates, "we practice psychic dampening combat. Your neural inhibitors will prevent lethal intent from translating to lethal action. You can go all out without actually killing your sparring partners, which is convenient because the paperwork for student deaths is extensive, and I find it boring." The class consisted of the usual mix of species, all wearing the Academy's standard combat suits that adjusted to various anatomies. These suits monitored vital signs, displayed tactical data, and most importantly, interfaced with the neural dampeners that prevented training exercises from becoming funeral arrangements. The dampeners were sophisticated pieces of technology that read aggressive intent and automatically limited physical output to non-lethal levels. They worked on the principle that the brain could want to punch through someone's chest cavity, but the dampener would ensure the fist stopped at bruising force. It was like having a very responsible babysitter for one's murderous impulses. Among the students lounged Kexthor, a Crithian who stood 7 feet of coiled muscle and crystalline scale armor. The Crithian species hailed from a high-gravity world where evolution had decided that subtlety was for the weak and everyone should be built like a living tank. Their bones were dense as neutron star material, Their scales could deflect most small arms fire, and their strength-to-weight ratio made them natural wrestlers. Kexithor possessed all these advantages, plus the additional gift of an ego that could be seen from orbit. He reclined against the wall with the casual arrogance of someone who had never lost a fair fight and saw no reason to start worrying about it now. "Humans," he said to his cluster of friends, his voice carrying the distinctive clicking harmonics of his language overlaid with the translator's flat approximation. "Why do they even bother? No scales, no natural weapons, no redundant organs. They are like babies playing at war." His companions laughed, a sound like rocks in a gravel mixer. The Crithian next to him, Velrex, gestured toward the other side of the room. "I heard one of them cried last week during endurance training. Cried! Like a hatchling." What they failed to mention, either through ignorance or selective memory, was that the human in question had been crying while still running, had finished the course, and had then vomited with such force that it was recorded as a new Academy distance record. Humans had a peculiar relationship with their body's warning systems, treating messages like "stop immediately or die" as suggestions rather than instructions. On the opposite side of the training hall stood Mira Chen. Though her instructors butchered the pronunciation in 17 different ways, depending on their vocal apparatus. She was 5 feet 6 inches of compact muscle, with black hair pulled into a practical braid and eyes that suggested she was constantly calculating the structural weaknesses of everyone in the room. She wore the standard combat suit without decoration or flair, and possessed the general demeanor of someone waiting for a bus in the rain, if that bus might require fighting off several armed opponents. Mira had joined the Academy 6 months ago through the human military's exchange program, which was a polite way of saying they wanted to see if their soldiers could keep up with galactic standards. She had spent those 6 months being consistently underestimated, which suited her fine. While other species evolved natural weapons, humans had evolved the ability to create them, to learn, to adapt, and to hold grudges that could last generations. Her people had climbed from the food chain's middle to its apex through the power of spite and sharp sticks, and the sharp sticks had gotten significantly more sophisticated since then. She had noticed Kexithor, of course. He was difficult to miss, both physically and personality-wise. He moved through the academy like he owned the place and was considering whether to leave a tip. She had watched him in previous sparring sessions, noted his techniques, his preferences, his tells. He favored his right side by approximately 15 degrees, dropped his back left shoulder before grappling attempts, and possessed the tactical awareness of a particularly confident brick. Instructor Vexral began pairing students for sparring matches, his massive hands consulting a datapad that looked comically small in his grip. Kexithor, you will face the human female. Try not to break her too badly. The medical bay staff complain when I send them fragmented students. The Crithian's face split into what his species considered a smile, which most other species considered evidence of imminent violence. He stepped onto the combat mat with the swagger of someone who had already won and was just waiting for everyone else to acknowledge it. "This will be brief," he announced to no one in particular. "Perhaps I will be gentle." Mira stepped onto the mat without commentary, her expression neutral as morning weather. She performed the traditional bow to her opponent, a gesture Kexithor returned with exaggerated slowness, making it clear he considered this a formality rather than respect. "Neural dampeners active," Vexral announced, checking his monitoring equipment. "Standard sparring rules apply. Fight until submission, incapacitation, or I get bored watching. Begin." Kexithor moved first, because of course he did. He circled right, testing her reaction time with a few probing jabs that could have pulverized concrete. The dampeners caught his strikes, limiting them to merely bone-bruising force, rather than bone-shattering. Mira slipped the first two, blocked the third, and gave ground in a way that suggested retreat rather than strategy. The Crithian pressed his advantage, because that is what confidence does when it meets apparent weakness. He launched a combination attack, fists and elbows flowing in patterns taught by Crithian combat masters over centuries. It was technically impressive, properly executed, and would have been devastating against someone who fought by the same rules. Mira, however, had grown up learning that rules were things other people followed while you kicked them somewhere uncomfortable. She ducked under a roundhouse that would have removed her head from her shoulders, stepped inside his guard, and delivered 3 rapid strikes to pressure points that the Crithian anatomy kept in inconveniently vulnerable locations. The dampeners prevented serious damage, but pain was still pain, and Kexithor's neural system registered that something had gone wrong with his left leg. He stumbled, more from surprise than injury, and his expression shifted from confidence to irritation. "Lucky strike," he growled, resetting his stance. Around the mat, other students had stopped their own matches to watch. Humans losing to superior species was expected entertainment. Humans making superior species stumble was interesting entertainment. They engaged again, and this time Kexithor brought his full strength to bear. He was faster than Mira, stronger than Mira, and possessed about 50 pounds of weight advantage plus natural armor. What he did not possess was 300,000 years of evolutionary spite and a childhood spent learning that the universe was not fair. So you might as well cheat. Mira gave ground again, letting him drive her backward across the mat, her defense seemingly desperate. Kexithor's friends cheered, shouting encouragement in their clicking language. The Crithian allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, which in combat is roughly equivalent to handing your opponent a written invitation to wreck your day. He reached out, almost contemptuously, and grabbed her braid. It was a dominance gesture in Crithian culture, claiming control of an opponent's head. He yanked backward, intending to expose her throat for the finishing strike that would end this farce. Mira moved with him, not resisting the pull, but accelerating into it, converting his strength into momentum. Her hand, which had been protecting her ribs, shot forward with her fingers extended in a strike that targeted the exposed neural cluster at the base of his throat. The dampeners caught it, prevented the strike from crushing his windpipe, but could not prevent the neurological feedback that made his entire body convulse. Before he could recover, she twisted in his grip, using his own hold on her hair as an anchor point. Her leg swept behind his, catching the knee that was already compromised from her earlier strikes. Gravity and leverage did what muscle could not, and Kexithor found himself falling, which was a novel experience for someone who typically did the throwing. He hit the mat hard, his back slamming against reinforced padding with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. Mira followed him down, her knee driving into his solar plexus with precisely calculated force. The dampeners prevented broken ribs, but they could not prevent the fundamental understanding that he was, for the first time in his academy career, genuinely outmatched. "You pulled my hair," she said, her voice calm as someone commenting on the weather. "That was rude." Kexithor tried to throw her off, using the strength advantage that should have made this trivial. She rode his movement, shifting her weight like water, and her elbow found the pressure point behind his jaw that made his vision sparkle with involuntary neural fireworks. He bucked again, more desperately now, and she allowed it, rolling away and bouncing back to her feet. The Crithian rose more slowly, his crystalline scales flushed with the purple hue that indicated elevated stress responses. Around the mat, silence had replaced the earlier commentary. Students watched with the fascination of people witnessing something that violated their fundamental understanding of how the universe worked. "Lucky," Kexithor repeated. But his voice carried less certainty now. He charged, abandoning technique for pure aggressive fury. It was a mistake. But pride makes people stupid, and Kexithor had plenty of pride to spare. Mira did not retreat this time. She moved forward, inside the arc of his charge, too close for his longer limbs to generate proper force. Her strikes came in rapid succession, each one targeted with surgical precision at nerve clusters, joint weaknesses, and the small gaps in his scale armor that evolution had failed to cover. The dampeners worked overtime, preventing crippling damage. But they could only do so much against someone who understood anatomy as a collection of exploitable failures. She struck behind his right knee, hyperextending ligaments. Hit the nerve bundle in his left shoulder that made his arm go temporarily numb. Drove her knuckles into the floating ribs that all Crithians possessed as an evolutionary holdover from their aquatic ancestors. Each strike was economical, efficient, and delivered with the casual precision of someone swatting flies. Kexithor swung wildly now, his movements losing cohesion as pain and confusion rewrote his combat algorithms. He caught her once, a glancing blow to the shoulder that would have shattered bone without dampeners. She rolled with it, converted the impact into rotation, and came around with a spinning elbow that caught him across the temple. His eyes lost focus. Not from the impact alone, but from the cumulative effect of 17 precisely targeted strikes to his neurological system. Each one individually minor, but collectively devastating. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Except the cuts were controlled, and the death was just his dignity. He dropped to one knee, his body's automatic response to systems registering critical damage that the dampeners insisted was not actually there. Confusion warred with instinct, and both lost to the simple fact that his muscles were no longer accepting commands with their usual efficiency. Mira stood before him, not even breathing hard, and pulled her braid over her shoulder to examine the end where he had grabbed it. "You stretched it out," she observed, with the tone of someone noting that their coffee had gone cold. "This braid took me 20 minutes this morning." She moved almost casually, her hand catching the back of his head in a grip that was not quite gentle, but not quite violent. She pulled him forward and down, using his own weight and compromised balance against him. His face met the mat with a thud that was more psychological than physical, the dampeners ensuring nothing broke except possibly his worldview. "Submission!" Vexral called, his voice carrying an undercurrent of satisfaction. The instructor had been teaching long enough to appreciate when an overconfident student learned something valuable. Match concluded. Medical assessment required for Kexithor. The Crithian lay on the mat, not unconscious but not precisely functional either, his nervous system trying to determine why everything hurt when the diagnostic data said he was fine. It was the neurological equivalent of a philosophical crisis, and Mira had delivered it with the same care most people gave to ordering lunch. She stepped back, rolled her shoulders to resettle her combat suit, and walked to the edge of the mat without looking back. Behind her, medical drones descended with the efficient bustle of equipment that had seen this scenario play out too many times before. The other students parted before her like water around a stone, their expressions ranging from shock to calculation, to the careful respect one gives to things that might be dangerous. She ignored them, collected her water bottle, and took a long drink while watching Instructor Vexral help Kexithor to his feet. The Crethian stood on unsteady legs, his scales still showing stress coloration. He looked at Mira with an expression that might have been anger, or might have been the beginning of understanding. In his culture, strength was respected, but so was the wisdom to recognize when you had been comprehensively outclassed. "How?" he managed, his voice rougher than usual. The dampeners should have prevented that. Mira considered her answer while taking another sip of water. They prevented damage, she said finally. They do not prevent pain or technique or consequences. You learned the difference today. Vexral's booming laugh filled the training hall. Excellent summary. Kexthor, report to Medical Bay for neural stabilization. The rest of you, consider what you witnessed. The dampeners save your lives, but they cannot save you from being comprehensively beaten by someone who understands how bodies work. He turned to Mira with something approaching approval. Clean execution. Where did you learn Krathian neurological vulnerabilities? I read the Academy. Library's anatomical database, Mira replied. Also, your species keeps your medical textbooks in the public access section. Poor information security. The instructor's expression suggested he was reassessing several security protocols. Noted. Take a break, then pair with someone else. Perhaps someone who will keep their hands to themselves. Mira nodded and moved to the side of the room, where she sat with her back against the wall and watched the other matches resume. Students gave her significantly more personal space now. A buffer zone of respect mixed with uncertainty. She did not mind. Personal space was underrated. Across the hall, Kexthor limped toward the exit with the assistance of a medical drone, his friends trailing behind in subdued silence. The betting pool that had existed regarding the match's outcome had dissolved into arguments about technicalities and whether anyone had actually won anything. One of the human students, a tall man named Marcus Rivera, who had been at the academy for 8 months, approached Mira with cautious respect. That was educational, he said, settling against the wall a polite distance away. Did you really study all the species' anatomies? Just the ones that looked like they might start something, Mira replied. Seemed practical? How many is that? All of them. Marcus laughed, the sound carrying genuine appreciation. You have a gift for making friends. I have a gift for ending fights, Mira corrected. Friends are optional. Not losing is not. They watched in companionable silence as Vexral paired off the remaining students for sparring sessions. The matches proceeded with noticeably more caution than before, students circling each other with the wariness of people who had been reminded that assumptions were dangerous. By the time the class period ended, news of the match had spread through the Academy's social networks with the speed that gossip achieves in closed environments. By dinner, 3 different versions of events circulated, each more embellished than the last. By the following morning, station legend had transformed it into an epic confrontation where Mira had supposedly defeated Kexthor while blindfolded and humming show tunes. Mira ignored the attention with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that reputation was just organized rumor. She attended her classes, completed her training exercises, and studied the anatomical weaknesses of the species she had not yet memorized. The Thessian razorbacks, she discovered, had a fascinating vulnerability in their tertiary nervous system. She filed that information away for future reference. Kexthor returned to classes 3 days later, moving with slightly more caution and significantly less swagger. He nodded to Mira when their paths crossed in the corridor outside the combat hall, a gesture of acknowledgement that his species gave to warriors of proven capability. She returned it, the brief exchange carrying more meaning than conversation could have managed. In the following weeks, something interesting happened. Kexthor stopped lounging during classes and started paying attention. He asked questions about technique, about leverage, about the places where strength became a disadvantage. He stopped treating sparring as a demonstration of dominance and started treating it as education. His friends, observing this transformation, gradually followed his example. The human students, meanwhile, discovered that their reputation had shifted. Where once they had been dismissed as soft-skinned curiosities playing at warfare, they were now regarded with cautious interest. Other species began asking questions about human combat techniques, about their training methods, about the philosophy that treated every fight as solvable problem, rather than a test of natural advantages. Instructor Vexral watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone whose job occasionally produced results beyond simple competence. During one afternoon session, he paired Mira and Kexithor again, interested to see what 6 weeks of reflection had produced. They bowed to each other with genuine respect this time. When the match began, Kexithor did not charge. He circled, observed, tested her defense with careful strikes rather than overwhelming force. He had learned that strength without strategy was just violence waiting to be redirected. The match lasted longer this time, both fighters adapting to each other's techniques in real time. Kexithor used his strength intelligently now, creating opportunities rather than relying on natural advantages. Mira found herself actually working, her movements less economical as she dealt with an opponent who had learned from his mistakes. In the end, she won again, but it was closer. Kexithor submitted when she achieved a joint lock that the dampeners could not make comfortable, and he did so with the calm acceptance of someone who understood that losing was just another form of learning. "Better," Mira said, releasing the hold and helping him up. "You thought this time." "Thinking is painful," Kexithor replied, his translator rendering the irony in his voice. "But less painful than what you did to me last time." They exchanged grips, a gesture that crossed species boundaries through shared understanding. Around them, the class watched with interest that had evolved beyond spectacle into genuine engagement with the learning process. After class, as students filtered toward the cafeteria with its universally terrible food, Vexral called Mira aside. The massive Chromagon looked down at her with his 4 eyes conveying a complex expression. "You have changed the dynamic of this class," he said. "Made them think about combat as intellectual exercise rather than physical dominance display. This is good teaching, even if you accomplished it by beating arrogance out of a Crithian." Mira considered this. "I just did not want someone pulling my hair again. The rest was bonus." "Motivation is irrelevant if results are positive," Vexral replied. "You have demonstrated principle that should be carved alongside Academy motto. Natural advantages mean nothing against prepared opponent." "Should I get that embroidered on my combat suit?" "Your combat suit, no. Perhaps we put it on Wall of Shame in Medical Bay, where Kexithor can contemplate it during neural stabilization treatments." The instructor's expression might have been a smile, though on a Chromagon it looked more like a threat display. "Continue as you are. Galaxy needs more fighters who understand that winning fight begins with understanding opponent." Mira nodded and headed toward the cafeteria, where dinner awaited with its promise of nutritionally complete disappointment. Behind her, Vexral made notes on his datapad about curriculum adjustments and whether the Academy's insurance premiums needed recalculation. In the cafeteria, Mira collected her meal, a gray protein compound that claimed to be synthesized meat, but fooled absolutely no one. She found a seat near the observation windows that looked out over the gas giant the station orbited. The view was spectacular, a swirling mass of storms and atmospheric chaos that made for peaceful contemplation while eating terrible food. Marcus joined her, carrying his own tray of culinary disappointment. "You are becoming famous," he said. 3 different species asked me today if all humans fight like you. What did you tell them? That you are completely average for a human, and they should be terrified of our combat specialists." He grinned. Figured it could not hurt our reputation. It could hurt if they take you seriously and send actually challenging opponents. Would that be so bad? Mira thought about it while pushing gray protein around her plate. No, she decided. Would at least make sparring interesting. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the storms rage across the planet below with forces that could atomize starships. The galaxy was vast, filled with species that had evolved countless advantages and abilities that humans lacked. But humans had learned long ago that lacking natural gifts just meant you developed unnatural ones. They had climbed to civilization through creativity, adaptability, and the fundamental refusal to accept that the universe owed them fair fights. Somewhere in the station, Kexisthor was probably still processing the philosophical implications of being defeated by someone smaller, weaker, and entirely lacking in natural armor. It was a valuable lesson, one that warriors of every species eventually learned if they survived long enough. Strength came in many forms, and the most dangerous opponents were the ones who understood which form mattered in each specific moment. The Interstellar Combat Academy would continue its mission, training warriors from across the galaxy in the controlled application of violence. Students would learn techniques, practice, forms, and occasionally discover that their assumptions about combat effectiveness needed significant revision. The cafeteria food would remain terrible. The medical bay would maintain busy operations. And somewhere in the training halls, another overconfident student would learn what their instructors had been trying to teach all along. Natural advantages were real. They mattered in combat, provided edges that technique alone could not overcome. But advantages were not victory, and underestimating opponents based on assumptions was just asking the universe to correct your worldview with force. Mira finished her meal, returned her tray, and headed back to her quarters to study. The Voronaki phase shifting created interesting tactical opportunities, and she wanted to understand the energy signatures before her next sparring session with one. Knowledge was just another weapon, and she believed in maintaining her arsenal. Behind her, the station continued its eternal orbit, a small bubble of civilization and controlled violence spinning through the infinite dark. Inside, hundreds of students from dozens of species learned that the galaxy was bigger than their assumptions. Combat was more complex than their instincts, and sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room was the quiet person studying everyone else's weaknesses. And sometimes, just sometimes, pulling someone's hair in combat class turned out to be the beginning of a very educational experience in humility, delivered with the precise application of neurological pressure points and the cold satisfaction of someone whose morning hairstyle had been rudely disrupted. The Academy's motto remained unchanged, carved in 17 languages for 17 species to contemplate. But somewhere in the training halls, a new understanding had taken root. Excellence through controlled violence was important. But so was the wisdom to control your assumptions before they got you dropped on your face by someone who had done their homework. And that, the galaxy would gradually learn, was very much a human approach to problems. They lacked scales, claws, telepathy, and most natural advantages. But they possessed something equally dangerous: the stubborn insistence that limitations were just puzzles waiting for creative solutions. And every fight was winnable if you were willing to study, adapt, and aim for the nerve clusters. In combat class, he had pulled her hair. She had responded by pulling apart his understanding of how fights worked. In retrospect, which was always clearer than foresight, it was obvious which approach would prove more effective. But then again, obvious lessons were the ones that needed teaching most often, usually with force, occasionally to Crithians who should have known better. The galaxy continued spinning, indifferent to the lessons learned in one training hall on one station orbiting one gas giant among trillions. But the students who had witnessed it carried the knowledge forward, spreading through the military hierarchies and combat schools of their respective species. And sometimes, when facing human opponents, they remembered a simple truth. Do not pull their hair. They take